Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all here on this special occasion to commemorate the life and work of Professor Mike Miller, AO. My name is Graham Dandy. I'm Chair of the South Australian and Northern Territory Division of the Academy of Technology and Engineering, abbreviated ATSE. I'd first of all like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet. We acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and we also welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people meeting with us this afternoon. I'd particularly like to welcome Edith Miller and members of her family, Christina, Karen, David and Leonie, as well as Mike's sisters, Mary Smith and Colleen West. There are also several other members of Mike's family who are connecting in via Zoom, and it's really pleasing to see a terrific turn up this afternoon. I think we have 45 people here in person and a similar number, or around 40, connecting online. This event has been organised by the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the CEO of ATSE, Kylie Walker, Alan Finkel, who will be speaking a little later as past president of ATSE, and also Mira Verma, who's on the board of ATSE, as well as a number of ATSE fellows who are here this afternoon. I did receive some apologies from Peter Hoy, Ian Gould and Di Davidson. This afternoon we have 4 speakers who will talk about Mike's outstanding contributions to the work of the Academy, as well as his significant contributions to research and entrepreneurship in the field of communications. Also, 2 of the speakers will be talking about the future development of research in the communications area. The speakers are Professor Alan Finkel, AC, who will speak about Mike's contribution to the Academy, Dr. Craig Mudge, AO, who will speak about Mike's significant work in the field of communications, Dr. Sylvie Perreault, who will speak about her research with Mike and the latest developments in wireless communications, and Mark Rice, who will speak about his research with Mike and the latest developments in satellite communications. On a personal note, Mike was chair of the South Australian Division when I became a fellow in 2007. I found Mike very welcoming, very friendly and inclusive. He always made me feel welcome at meetings, always introduced people around, made sure everybody got on. He was extremely easy to work with. When I joined the division committee, I found that Mike was extremely active in organising events and serving on committees. He had a huge amount of energy and he was always willing to volunteer and draw on his wide network of contacts in industry and academia. He was fantastic to work with. And I'd have to say it was a great privilege and pleasure for me and many ATSE fellows to have known and worked with such an outstanding person as Mike. I'd now like to introduce Kylie Walker, the CEO of ATSE, to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Academy. And after that, Kylie will be followed by Mira, who will introduce the first 2 speakers. Thank you, Kylie.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you all of you for being here both in person and online, and of course here on beautiful Kaurna country. I also acknowledge the traditional owners and the 60,000 years of engineering and technological innovation that are represented by the oldest living culture on the planet. And we're very, very blessed to live in the country that connects us across all of those years and those millennia. Edith and all of Mike's family, it's a real pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for being here tonight. Fellows of the Academy and friends, it's wonderful to see you here. So the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, for those of you who don't know it so well, is a fellowship of around 900 of the leading experts in Australia in applied science, technology and engineering. And we have a mission to help Australians understand and use technology to solve complex problems. We support that mission by providing policy advice and advocacy to leadership, primarily federal political leadership, but not exclusively, and through a range of programs designed to educate and excite and inspire young people in science and technology and provide career pathways for them, not just to be educated, but to be wrapped around to be able to thrive and excel in applied science, technology and engineering. And here, I think this year, on the 150th anniversary of the Overland Telegraph connecting Darwin to Adelaide, it's marvellous, actually, to be able to celebrate one of the greatest contributors that we've had in recent times to that mission of helping Australians understand and use technology to solve complex problems. I only had the privilege of working with Mike for a couple of short years, but in that time, I found him to be extraordinarily generous with his time. He saw the sharing of his long years of expertise as deep community service, and he always contributed to the Academy's work with that ethos in mind. He was kind, he was collegiate, he was inclusive, he was incredibly energetic. He acted as a board director and vice president for some time. As Graham mentioned, was the chair of the South Australian division and sat on a range of other committees, most recently as the chair of the Digital Futures Forum. And I think that's probably the final thing that I want to say before we get on with the speeches and hear from people far more knowledgeable than I. And that is that we often find, I think, that people can tend to become very fixed in their perspective as they move through life. And Mike was one of those people who never did that when it came to his knowledge and his expertise. He was always learning, he was always growing, he was always striving to the future of technology. And so the work that he did with the Academy encompassed not just those areas that Graham has mentioned and we'll hear a little bit more about tonight, but also cutting edge areas of telecommunications and technology more generally, artificial intelligence among them. And so I, on behalf of the Academy, would just like to note our incredible gratitude for his contributions and the work that he did, which lives on beyond him, which continues to inform the advocacy and the advice that we give to leadership across Australia. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I look forward to hearing the talks.
Always have to lower the mic. It is with mixed feelings I stand here, of course, because I'm really sad that Mike's not here. I'm sure he would have laughed to hear us talking about him like in such glowing terms, which are absolutely deserved. But on the other hand, I'm really pleased that we're finding time to get together and just celebrate his contribution and his life. And I'm really honored to be introducing Alan Finkel. Is Alan online now? Great. Most of you probably know Alan as the 8th Chief Scientist of Australia. I thought, what can I tell you that you may not know? Well, you may not know he's an electrical engineer and a neuroscientist and a philanthropist. I'm sure you all know he's a publisher setting up the magazine Cosmos. But in the early 80s, Alan founded Axon Instruments. It was sold 20 years later for what was then a record-breaking price. And Alan, I think it might still be a record-breaking uplift in terms of the biotech area. And all of us young biotechies at the time took great motivation and encouragement from what Alan managed to do with Axon. Alan's currently special advisor to the Australian government on low emissions technology. And I think, as someone mentioned, he was president of ATSE from 2013 to 2015. And he worked with Mike when Mike was a board member at that time. Thank you for joining us, Alan.
Thank you, Mira. Can you just acknowledge that you can hear me and see me? Well, I'll assume that you can. So thank you, Mira, for those kind words, and Carly and Graham. And I'm directing my words to you, dear Edith, and to family and friends of Mike. My first meeting with Mike in 2006 was shortly after I had been elected as a fellow of ATSE, and I had been asked to provide a proposal for a new secondary school science education course called Stella. Now, as Mira had said, having run my own small company, actually all my working life, I knew nothing about large organisations and even less about learned academies. But Mike knew it all, and he took it upon himself to gently introduce me to the nuances. Even further beyond my ken, Mike knew how governments operated, and he managed to persuade the Federal Minister of Education to visit one of our stellar schools and express his support. I have since learned from having met some of Mike's graduate students that his enthusiasm for educating the next generation, be they school students, undergraduates, or PhD students, was a defining commitment across his whole career. For me, it wasn't just the Stellar program. Indeed, I was highly privileged that Mike saw fit to take me under his wing, kind of as my de facto mentor, from soon after I was elected an ATSE Fellow through to my period as President from 2013 to 2015. I joined ATSE with fresh ideas. Mike nurtured them and helped to turn them into deliverables. And for that, I owe him much gratitude. When I was President of ATSE, Mike was a Vice President, after having been appointed an inaugural board member when the board was established in 2008. And as a fellow board member, Mike helped me understand the disparate needs of fellows and divisions. Without Mike, I can say that my time as President would have been less productive, less satisfying. One of the challenges I inherited when I started as President of ATSE was to complete the constitutional reform started by my predecessor. Mike assisted not only at board level, but in the state level consultations, hosting discussion groups in South Australia on the planned constitutional changes and steering these through the system. As Vice President for Membership, Mike was responsible for refining the guidelines and processes for selecting new fellows and managing the expectations of disappointed fellows whose nominees did not get elected. It was a tough gig, but through his intellect and fairness, Mike kept everybody on side and feeling respected. As we've heard, Mike was never one to sit idle. For example, he established a program of parliamentary briefings by ATSE Fellows in South Australia to update politicians on technology matters that they themselves identified as being of most interest to them. And this became the model for similar programs in other state divisions. He chaired the South Australian Division Committee, and in that role, Mike promoted collaborations with the Royal Institution of Australia, based in Adelaide, and the Australian Science Media Centre. One of the strengths of ATSE is the topic-specific forums. Mike was instrumental in establishing the Digital Futures Forum, and he was its inaugural chair. Through that forum, Mike led the discussion about how industry and society must prepare itself for the digital future. Expanding that work, Mike led the ATSE Digital Futures Forum to collaborate with the Australian Academy of Sciences Equivalent Committee to jointly publish a primer on digital futures. And he led the production for ATSE of a policy paper on the importance of digitalisation. Mike was an early supporter and co-founder of IMNIS. IMNIS, the Industry Mentoring Network in STEM. It was launched in 2015. IMNIS supports the personal development of Australia's future engineering, science and technology leaders by connecting them with experienced industry leaders for a year of mentoring and specific personal development programs. The idea for IMNIS was brought to ATSE from the outside. As president, I was pretty sure it was something we wanted to adopt, but you can never be sure. The support from Mike and other board members was unequivocal, and thus IMNIS was brought into the ATSE fold. And further, Mike confirmed his confidence and commitment by agreeing to be an inaugural member of the IMNIS Expert Advisory Panel. Mike was also very active in ATSE's international work. In particular, he was passionately involved in nurturing relations between South Korea and Australia in science and technology generally, and specifically in building on his long-term IT and telecommunications links with Korea. This would sometimes involve joint projects with ATSE and the National Academy of Engineering of Korea. In these activities, Mike brought his experience as a long-term member of the board of the Australia-Korea Foundation, which was organised by the Department of Foreign Affairs. With ATSE's support led by Mike, the foundation funded an early career research program. Years later, when I was Australia's chief scientist and leading a review of the national electricity market after the whole of the whole of state blackout in South Australia, Mike put together advice for me on the history and limitations of the operation of the electricity market, all of which I eagerly absorbed. And he continued to engage with me and help on the educational activities that I led from my new role. Mike had boundless skills, so ably recorded for posterity by the conferring on him of the 2017 FTSE Medal, the highest award to honour a lifetime of achievement in information and communication technology in Australia. Mike gave where he could and invested in the common good. Somewhere during those years, on a visit to Adelaide hosted by Mike in his capacity as chair of the South Australian division of ATSE, I was fortunate enough to meet delightful Edith, and I was honoured to enjoy a friendly overnight stay at the Miller family home. Edith, your intelligence, academic training and charm were a perfect complement to Mike, which was very evident in the warmth of your relationship with each other. Mike was a kind and generous host and embodied the meaning of ATSE fellowship. When Mike retired as vice president, I wrote to him and I said, "Gosh, I'm going to miss you in the role." And today I say the same, slightly updated to the present tense. Gosh, Mike, I miss you. To Edith, family and friends, take heart in your joyous memories of a wonderful man. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. There were really lovely words about Mike there. It's now my pleasure to introduce Craig Mudge, AO and a long-term fellow of ATSE. Craig was foundation professor of computer science in the early 1990s. He founded Oztec Microsystems, which produced chips that were the basis for CSIRO's Wi-Fi patents. So he's been involved in the digital side of things for a very, very long time. But in the mid to late 90s, Craig was director of the iconic Xerox Palo Alto Research Labs, where he nurtured the next generation of internet protocols. At ATSE, Craig worked really closely with Mike Miller on the Digital Futures Forum. So he's the perfect person to tell us a little bit about what Mike was doing with Digital Futures. Thank you, Craig.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Mira. And it's indeed an honor to talk about Mike, who's had so much impact here and throughout the country. I want to talk a bit about his research and entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurship ranged from his own activities of getting companies like Mnet going, but he was particularly strong in getting new enterprises started by his students. And two that I'll talk about at the end are Cohda and Myriota. After Mike finished his undergraduate degree, he worked with the PMG's department for a while, forerunner of Telstra, of course, Postmaster General. But then I'm going to start the story really by looking at his PhD, because he did that at the University of Hawaii, which had tremendous impact on the design and implementation of computer networks. The driving need for networks in Hawaii was the fact that the population was spread across a few islands. And ALOHAnet was the first network, and it's the first demo of wireless packet radio networks. But going on, Ethernet, which 1973, we kept on having a celebration at Xerox Park each 10 years. And it's you know, Ethernet is what's flowing around this room and flows around your homes, but it was, it shared the shared media protocol with ALOHAnet. So ALOHAnet first said, you know, sense what is happening. Is anybody on the channel at the moment? If yes, back off. And that was developed in several generations. Mike did his PhD there, as I was saying, and the title was a study of automatic requests which was an important protocol in the communication sender to receiver. And it enabled error correction, the management of errors. And I'm a computer designer, and we didn't have the same error problems because our signals stayed within the computer. But once the signals went off over a network, over a satellite channel, over whatever, you had to deal with errors. And so these communications types spend all this time worrying about errors, detecting them and correcting them, and doing it in a very efficient way. So that was a much harder job in my view. In this case here, I'm not driving this very well. Okay, just very quickly, I've put there the various layers of underlying an application. So an application using telecommunications, such as receiving a movie on your iPhone or GPS from much further away, sits at the bottom level on the hardware. It might be a cable, there might be an antenna involved, often an analog to digital converter. And above that, next layer are algorithms, the Fourier transform, error correction, and so on. And then there's this layer that I highlight as digital signal processing, which pervades all of Mike's work. And his students just had a sense of DSP, of digital signal processing, that no other students have been able to get. Next one, please. The Institute for Telecoms Research, and there are quite a few people here tonight who were part of that, right to Bill, who actually led it for a while. At the University of South Australia, now, I don't know how well you can read that, because I'm going to read out some of it. The group was formed, known as the Digital Communications Group, in 85 at UniSA. And then that first year, they had their first collaboration and contract with Defence Science and Technology. And those, I haven't listed every year, but I've just highlighted a few. In 1987, a 2 megabit per second satellite modem for Intelsat, which was Australia's OTC, which became, of course, eventually ended up as Optus. There, you'll notice there's working with industry. And working with industry was a part of Mike's work throughout his entire research time. In 1988, a mobile satellite modem for AUSSAT. In 89, he was elected a fellow of IEOST, and in 1990, Inmarsat. This was where Telecom provided funding, and that began a multi-year relationship between the University of South Australia and Telecom to advance the field in Australia. Then there was another research centre set up under Mike, the Australian Space Centre for Signal Processing, which developed, again, different protocols for the reliable transmission in space telemetry. Some of that was used in, much of that was used in remote sensing. And then in 1992, the Signal Processing Research Institute was formed, and Henry de Samcho, who is the leader of that, is here tonight. And the Institute for Telecommunications Research was housed in the Spree building. At which point the Digital Communication Group became ITR. In 1995, doing some work for Inmarsat, and this was in initial studies with higher order modulation and turbo coding. Now, turbo coding is a way of using coding to get close to 100% utilization of the medium, close to the Shannon theory of what a medium is calculated. And it had only been developed in 91, the first patents were in 91, and Mike had the ITR working in turbo coding very early on. Then there was the CRC for satellite systems, and in 2000 retired, and Mike retired, and MNet was formed. And Horton Wilshire is here tonight. He ran MNet after Mike for some time. The guys had an idea. They wanted to provide internet access along North Terrace in Adelaide. And the natural thing, a non-thinking approach, would be to say, well, we'll go to the telco supplier and we'll use whatever the telco supplier will give us. Oh, no, these guys went ahead and used Wi-Fi. So they made Wi-Fi available on, which would not have made Telstra happy at all, but I think it's a great solution. MNet went on. There was a major international congress on IT in Adelaide in 2002, and the facility that MNet provided was used in that Congress in 2002. FedSat, and here I had an email from one of my colleagues, Trevor Bird in CSIRO, who worked with Mike, and who they worked together in FedSat. And Trevor, in describing what they were doing, again recognized the collaboration and the genuineness of the man, Mike. And that has come across in all of the discussions I've had. ITR won the Gold Cup for turbo coding technology in 2003. And then the next stage began with Alex Grant at age 33, one of Mike's PhD students, winning the Tall Poppy Science Award. And Alex is an absolute star and went on to form Myriota, which I'll say a little bit about in a minute. If we could have the next, hang on. Yeah, the next slide, please. In '94, Mike and I actually did something together. I was at Flinders. We were developing the forerunner of Zoom, which was actually putting those meeting rooms at the bottom right hand there across the Pacific, across Australia. And I decided, well, look, just for the hell of it, let's see if we can add satellite. I mean, we didn't have to use satellite to go from Flinders part of Adelaide to another part of Adelaide, but just for the hell of it, we wanted to get a different mode, and that was a pleasure to be able to do that. And the University of South Australia node was actually there, as I showed it, in the Signal Processing Research Institute. The next slides, please. Now, Cohda was one of the startups headed by students of mine. Now, this is the, driverless cars. And to make them safe, there are all sorts of communications going on there. The GPS coming in from the heavens, vehicle to infrastructure. So vehicle looking at beacons along the side of the road. That's the vehicle to infrastructure at the bottom. Vehicle to pedestrian, that is recognizing pedestrians. And then the vehicle to vehicle on the bottom right-hand side is where that is one of the most important of the channels to look at. And Cohda has done an enormous amount of work in that. And so that's just an example of the nurturing that Mike has done. One more slide, please. Myriota was founded by Alex Grant, and they use the word Internet of Things, which means connecting anything on the planet via the internet. And Myriota actually provides secure direct-to-orbit satellite connectivity, very low-powered sensors. So here I've shown a sensor which is looking at the depth in a dam, and the gadget is communicating direct to the satellite on the right. Very low-powered sensor, 2 AA batteries lasting up to 5 years. So that's the technological achievement of the Myriota boys and girls that's part of it. We see this, it's one of the star companies at Lot 14. It's a low Earth orbit satellite, and again, look for some great things there. So I just give tribute to an absolute marvelous man. I've talked about some of the technical achievements and the enterprise that he has shown. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Craig. Very insightful presentation. A lot of information, and really shows what a beacon Mike was in terms of his work. I have to give credit to Craig in terms of the planning of this session, because when we were talking about having this, Craig said, well, let's not just talk about what Mike did, but let's talk about what the future is in communications. And, there are links between, as Craig has shown, there are links between Mike's work and how it's leading into the current technology. So it's not just all history. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Sylvie Perot. We actually have 2 speakers now who both worked with Mike at UniSA. Sylvie graduated from Telecom Paris Tech with a PhD in telecommunications signal processing. She worked in industry during her PhD studies and academia at the University of Connecticut and at UniSA for 13 years. She established an international reputation in the areas of wireless sensor networks with over 80 publications and 1,700 citations. She joined DSTO, now DSTG, in 2011, where she worked predominantly in the intelligence domain before leading the contested communications branch. She has recently been appointed as the designate chief of the newly formed Sensors and Effectors Division at DSTG. Thank you, Sylvie.
Thank you. So I thought today I might talk about the future trends and directions in the area of wireless communications, but also how they relate to a lot of the work that was initiated by Mike Miller in ITR. So I'm going to cover wireless communication, terrestrial communications mostly, and Mark is going to talk about SATCOMs. There we go. I just thought I might start with this picture of Mike because it's another aspect of Mike that is not really known, and that's his advocacy for diversity and inclusion. And I have chosen this picture because that was taken on a trip back from Korea that I took with Mike. We were in Hong Kong. For the story behind this picture is we stopped in Hong Kong to interview a candidate who had applied in ITR several times from Hong Kong. And during the interview, the candidate took lots of pictures of us that he sent us afterwards, which was a bit unusual. But so this trip in Korea, I was going there to discuss a patent that Samsung wanted to put on some of the work that I had done as part of a contract that I had with ITR and work that was funded by Samsung. And Mike at the last minute decided that he was going to join me. And it was not very clear to me at the time, and it's not until very recently that I understood why Mike actually joined me on that trip. And that was because he was concerned that I was going to walk in a room full of male engineers in Korea, and that my voice was not going to be heard. So he thought he was going to come, but he did it in such a discreet way that, as I said, that was not, I only realized that only a couple of years ago when he was quite explicit about why he was on that trip. And the way he behaved, I thought, during those meetings was really the exemplar of inclusion. So you would say, for instance, when some of the engineers over there would talk to him and ask him questions, he would say, well, you've got your expert here, that's Sylvie, so don't talk to me, talk to her. And so to me, that was just really the exemplar of diversity and inclusion that Mike demonstrated in ITR. Okay. So here I've just got the evolution of wireless communications, starting from here from 1G to 4G. You can see all the different phones. I was just reflecting when I was preparing that slide that when you watch movies these days, you know exactly what year it is by just looking at the phone that people use in those movies. And it's interesting that at the time where I was in ITR, which was the mid to late 90s, that was the 2G at the time. So what we were working on under Mike's leadership was how do we improve the performance of 2G? So digital, so that was digital, GSM, CDMA. So the issues we were looking at the time were really mostly the issue of interference, low capacity. You didn't have many users in the same cell because there was this issue of interference, and also poor mobility. And the reason behind that being that obviously when you transmit a wireless signal, it doesn't propagate in a straight way. There's lots of distortions, reflections on buildings, trees, and there's a lot of work to be done to actually understand what this channel looks like and to reconstruct the signal. So that was the work that we were doing on blind channel equalization. To mitigate the interference, then we started working on techniques that use different antennas or different antennas elements, so with beamforming, multiple input, multiple outputs called MIMO that subsequently became massive MIMO. Obviously, a lot of work in information theory, coding, turbo coding, and also a bit of work on cognitive radios. So all this work we were doing for 2G. And looking ahead at 3G when you increase data rate. So subsequently over the years, the big catchphrase was, we want high data rate or higher data rates anytime, anywhere. And all the work we were doing at that time continued. So it was all the foundation of that work that was initiated by Mike Miller at that time, actually continued for a very long time and even to this day. So I thought that was interesting to see that this work, and I should say that even in the area of military communications, tactical communications, then these are the techniques that we use as well. And I'm very pleased to have a large number of staff in my branch that actually come from ITR and have all these skills that are really useful. There we go. So another area that we started working on under Mike's leadership, which at the time devastated me, was I had been used to work on, classical mobile communications with a fixed infrastructure. And one day he told me, well, I think you should really shift your focus on sensor networks. And at the time, that was again because moving from communications that carry voice to suddenly communication that have to connect to the internet, like we all knew that the internet protocols were not suited for wireless channels that have large losses. So you got me to study networks, which I had never studied before. As I said, I was a bit reluctant to do this because that was way out of my expertise. But I'm really glad that I followed his advice, because working on mobile ad hoc networks, sensor networks, and I got into this new area of cross-layer design, which was extremely new at the time. And again, something that people still work on nowadays. And perhaps all the work that we did then can only be fully implemented now with the advances in technology. So we work also on self-organization. So you can see that these networks, because they don't have the fixed infrastructure, they have to self-organize. So again, that was completely new at the time. And this self-organization aspects, again, nowadays is still a hot topic, where some of the techniques on distributed routing, power control, frequency allocation are still things that we look at. And I'm going to talk about it why. Oops, sorry. So what about today? So I think today, and I think some of you might have heard Dr. Dale Lambert from DSTG, who is now leading the division called Information Sciences. And I believe that he talked to some of you about the information age. So in the industrial age, people directly controlled machines. But today, people instead issue commands to information environments. So between the machine and the human, there is this information layer. So the human doesn't control the machine directly, controls the information that then controls the machine. And the humans, as we know, are completely controlled by information as well. So, of course, because now there's this, the importance of information, what carries information, of course, that's communications. And that has led to some kind of paradigm shift in like moving from what we wanted before, which was the users wanted higher data rates anytime, anywhere, to now we expect the communication networks themselves to provide the right information in the right form, at the right place, at the right time. So that's really a big paradigm shift here, where it's not the user that wants the information and says, I want this information. It's the networks that have to provide the user with the right information at the right place at the right time. So that leads us to what we talk about now, which is 5G, 6G, the Internet of Things, or in defense, we call it the Internet of Military Things. And that's the proliferation of connected devices and sensors that Craig talked about before. Obviously, we all know how successful Myriota has been. And again, the work that was done there that was initiated under Mike Miller's leadership. But there's another element, which is the data deluge and sense making. So you've got all this data. How do you make sense of this data? So at the moment, it's based on the cloud. So you send your data to a cloud that's doing some computing, fuses some information, and then sends it in the right form. However, that creates a lot of latency. And especially in military applications, then you don't want this latency. You want the warfighter to have the information straight away. So we are looking at other techniques that are not the traditional one that we looked at before. And that's why we say that AI now is a game changer for communications and network. So now you've got networks that are mission-driven, policy-based, but also even in the work that we were doing before, where we were doing coding, designing codes, or designing modulation for certain channels, then we can do that now with AI. And the reason for this is that the channels that we were trying to model, there's always, you make some assumptions of the channels. Sometimes they are not exactly right. And there was always this limitation about what we can model using signal processing to what really happens in reality. And especially when your channels change very rapidly, or whether if you are in contested environments where you have jamming, so that suddenly that happens, we don't know very well how to model jamming. So instead of having the traditional models, then we use what we call trainable radios using deep learning. And the reason we can do that now is that it's quite easy to implement them on software-defined radios. But another use of AI, which is relevant to some of the work that we used to do in ITR, which is, for instance, the MIMO work that I was talking about before, you can actually enhance the performance of these techniques with AI. There's also the network protocols that we used to design. Again, that sometimes they relied on some assumptions we were making that were not always valid. We can enhance now these protocols with using AI. And again, we can do that now. What we couldn't do 20 years ago is because now we've got software-defined networking. So as I said, now there's a shift. As a conclusion, we see there's a shift between the user-driven signal transmission optimization to now intelligent and converged sensing, storage, computing, and transmission. I talked about AI-based, AI-augmented wireless technologies and networking. I did not mention in this talk because that would have probably taken a little bit too long, but quantum communication also we see as a big game changer, especially for the management of security of wireless networks. So I just wanted to highlight that throughout the last 25 years, there are still lots of techniques that we were working on under the leadership of Mike that are still extremely relevant and are actually coming back full force because now we can actually augment them with AI technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvie, for that very interesting presentation and also a very personal note in terms of your work with Mike. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, last but not least, Professor Mark Rice, is an adjunct research professor with UniSA's Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics academic unit. Mark's substantive position is with the Defence Science and Technology Group, same as Sylvie, and he's leading an innovation project with Australian industry to develop next generation tactical radios. Mark joined Mike Miller's research team in 1989 after completing his PhD at Manchester University in the UK. Mark also leads a project with the SmartSat Collaborative Research Centre at Lot 14 with the partners NASA. And that's for satellite-based emergency communications during catastrophic disasters like floods and bushfires. You will see there's an international flavour in our presentations this evening. Mike obviously reached out internationally. He attracted people like Sylvie from France and also Mark from the UK. And as you've heard, he travelled internationally quite a bit too. So that's another element. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, ATSE, and thank you, Edith and the Millers for being here and all the fun we've had over the years. So I'm going to talk about satellites, and I think first point here is why satellites? Who needs them? Actually, they're expensive. They often blow up before they're being used. They're unreliable. Do we really have the skills to make them? We never needed them for the first fleet, and it's not much fun betting on them either. So what's all the fuss about with satellites? And after all, what have they ever done for Australia? Sorry for the misuse of Monty Python there, but there are some good reasons. The main one being that we live in a huge country, and just got a few, sorry, it's not working very well, but we've got lots of statistics there about the reasons why it's good to be able to communicate over very large areas. We actually have, apart from immediately in Australia, we also have a huge search and rescue area that Australia is responsible for. It was clear that Mike understood this fully, and there's the alternatives perspective that we tend to live around the coast and in population centres. However, there's lots of people who don't as well, so that's all important. Okay, so and just to illustrate this, thanks Godfrey, your things, but so we think about geostationary satellites where the satellite's fixed in the sky. It kind of makes it easy to find it, and it also can illuminate the whole side of the Earth. Now, the other option is using low Earth orbiting satellites. So geostationary is about 36,000 kilometers above the ground, whereas LEO satellites about 1,000. This does mean you can't see as far, but it's still big enough to cover most of Australia, which is pretty good. That high vantage point is very important. Mike was clearly inspired in his thinking about satellites and how they could address Australia's needs by the early work of Arthur C. Clarke's famous work on extraterrestrial relays. And he had a very clear view about the benefits that could be achieved in terms of connectivity across Australia. And he went about applying this in a very real form using his engineering skills. So go back a bit in history, as mentioned, the ITR itself started in 85, and it was at that time South Australian Institute of Technology. We specialised in signal processing. Actually, this was before my time, signal processing and information theory. There was strong focus on satellite communications. I met up with Mike around 1987 when he was visiting for a couple of months, and he was on talent spotting, and somehow he picked me anyway. But we had a few games of snooker and squash, and before I knew it, Mike had offered positions to Richard, my friend, and I, and we were coming out to Australia. So when I arrived, didn't know what to expect, and first of all, I found everyone squashed into a little room at the back of around the back of the paddock, and everyone was very excited because they were about to move into a hut, or as I called it, it was actually a portable cabin, but it was, and you'll see actually there's some of the people from back then squashed up in the portable cabin, but you know, there was a great spirit, and what we lacked in equipment, we made up for with enthusiasm, and we did some pretty amazing things there. So 94, that was when ITR itself actually became real. And the other thing I should mention is Mike, apart from organising satellite communications, he also helped out with weddings, and so he did Mike and Edith organised our wedding for us, so thank you. So moving on. So there was this very nice textbook actually, which Mike and some other people here contributed towards. I've got a copy here if anyone's interested in flicking through. It's well used actually, but this was, you know, part of it incorporates part of Mike's very strategic view of things, and I quoted a few things from there. You know, it's started off with a satellite communications textbook for the 1990s. Well, but it's still relevant. Lots of good examples in there, and it talks about a testament to the ability for engineers to translate dreams into reality. I thought that was good, and the ability to enable nations to communicate anywhere around the globe. Mike was a big thinker, and it was interesting his perspective. Look at the introduction. He talked about a technology under siege and the threat of extinction. Quite interesting. But then there was the fight back, and Mike was always a fighter, so he wasn't going to give up. So he also talked about where's satellite going to succeed, and he went into the niches where satellite absolutely makes the most sense. So there's mobile satellites systems, land mobile satellite systems in particular, where we did a lot of work, and LEO systems. At that time, the Iridium system was just coming about, and that was a big breakthrough. Okay, so it was an exciting time to be in the satellite business, and Mike had selected these niche areas: mobile satellites, high-speed demodulators. I'll say a bit more about mobile satellite in a minute, but for the high-speed demods, we were building the world's fastest, highest data rate systems, and it was pretty bleeding edge stuff. It was great fun as well. And we also had defence mobile communications. Only part of that was SATCOMs, but certainly SATCOMs was an important aspect within that. And then there was FedSat, which was an ambitious program, a celebration of centenary for 2001, centenary of Federation in 2001, hence the name, and designed and built in Australia by Australian engineers. And it operated for 3 years, so in space. So that was really something, and it sometimes doesn't get the recognition it deserved, and I think partly because the whole industry went into the doldrums for a few years around 2000, but a great achievement. I'll say a little bit about the program I was particularly involved in, which was the Australian digital voice service, or mobile sat, and that is me, by the way. That was using some of the equipment that we built at the ITR. This was it was actually the world's first digital regional satellite system, and it's operated with Optus satellites, and we worked with NEC Australia on developing the ground equipment terminals. So it was really a technology breakthrough at the time. Remember, this was before 2G. There wasn't any digital cellular system at this time. And unfortunately for this system, that came along about the same time. So it sort of got a bit gazumped, but nevertheless, it was a great achievement. And very, of course, it provided communications to the outback, which just wasn't available in a reliable way before, both low rate data and voice. So based on our successes, we were able to access some of the latest silicon technology, which didn't always work. And we were pretty fearless with our projects and perhaps naive, but Mike always looked after us. We had a safe environment where we could play around with things. And before we knew it, we were having people like Inmarsat and Intelsat knocking on the door, asking us to work on projects for them, which was good. Sorry. Thanks. There we go. So obviously there are lots of challenges. I think Mike was one of his greatest strengths was this ability to build capability. He had a passion for teaching and education, which was obvious to everyone, and he was able to build a world-class team from graduates. He'd picked them out, and before we knew it, these were leading experts in these areas. And it didn't happen overnight, but it was a consistent effort over a few years, and it was great to be part of that. He also had this great international network, so that came from his PhD years, that connection with the information theory people, coding, and that's how he met my supervisor in the first place. He brought these people together to culture. I listened to Michelle Simmons the other day, who's the founder of Silicon Quantum Computing, talking on the ABC radio. And she talked about overcoming the idea that Australia can't do it. And we absolutely faced that back in the 90s, 80s, 90s, about satellites. People just, why are you doing? Why would Australia bother with satellites? And talking to people in the taxi or whatever, just didn't make sense to a lot of people. But the important thing was it made sense to Mike, and he was able to explain that and translate that for people. And all of this is just pipe dreams unless you have money. So finance, Mike was great at bringing together a business plan and getting the funding sorted out. So that was key to the things that we did, of course. So what's the legacy from all this? Without doubt, the ITR was an exceptional nurturing ground for communications engineers, especially satellite communications. And our engineers ended up going all over the world. Actually, they went overseas, often returning later. It was also a spawning ground for startups, and we've heard a few of them. These are the satellite ones. So it's DSpace, which was my own spin-off, Small World Communications, Allspace, TCL, and now, of course, Myriota, which has raised tens of millions of dollars for satellite IoT. My own little startup at the moment was called Safety from Space. And we had a big impact on some of the systems. There's the Inmarsat Broadband Global Area Network, which basically we designed and developed the specification for that, which it was a global worldwide network for internet and voice. I mentioned about the high-speed satellite demodulators, and we did churn out a few publications, although I think we're probably stronger at building things, to be honest. So very briefly, I'm just going to mention one of the projects I'm working on that's got my attention at the moment, which is under this Safety from Space banner. And this is to do with providing satellite-based emergency communications so people in difficult situations, bushfires, floods, can get connected. This could be from anywhere across the country, and also there's a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of delays in responding to these remote situations. So we're doing some work with UniSA and the other partners there. Also NASA is a key partner, supported by the SmartSat CRC. Oops. Quick, sorry. And also NASA, they've actually asked us to look at designing a system for the astronauts. This is a lunar search and rescue beacon, so that if they should fall down a crater, we can find them and hopefully someone can go rescue them. So that's I mean, again, it's great that NASA is coming to Adelaide for that expertise, and it's the legacy of Mike that sits behind this. So the journey continues today, and it's been a lot of fun. And I'd like to say thank you to Mike, Edith, and all the Millers who've all contributed to get us to where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that very informative and very personal, in many ways, presentation. I think anybody who's brave enough to put their wedding photograph up deserves extra credit. Now, we have allowed a bit of time for questions. I'm not sure whether we can actually handle questions from people online, but we certainly can handle them from people in the audience. And in fact, I'd like to thank all the speakers for keeping really well to time. I was a little worried we'd be running over time, but we've actually have a little more time for questions than I anticipated. So that's great. And I might get Mark and Sylvie and Craig to come up here so they can handle or jump in as a panel on any questions that we have. And I'm looking for the first question. Rob Lewis is usually pretty good for a question. Have you?
So live stream folk.
Oh.
I wasn't going to ask, I was going to do it after this. I've got a silly question, actually. I've spent my whole life in the marine domain, underwater. I'm aware of signal attenuation and areas like problems and issues like that. In my career of looking at upwellings and systems, we did it basically using analog technology by hand. Today we've got sharks, seals, birds out there with instrumentation on them 365 days a year, recording data which we took years to capture in a week. But they have to come to the surface, or we have to retrieve the devices to actually get the data transmitted back to us. This may be a naive or even maybe a silly question, but I am aware that whales communicate over thousands of kilometres. Are we ever going to be able to do something similar underwater for communication? Because we've got the technology down there, but our biggest problem is actually capturing the signals.
Well, I know we've got a couple of submarine experts here, so who might be able to say something. But I think obviously there's a problem with radio wave propagation through the water. So I think using other signals to get through long distances is an interesting one. I'm not a specialist in that, but I guess the idea of maybe having kind of surface-based relays that could pick up signals from an area of tens of kilometres, perhaps using the sort of technique you were talking about. But perhaps one of the other.
basic problem with your fish and whales is that electromagnetic radiation just doesn't work underwater. There's a narrow window in the blue-green, but you can't use other than, the most effective technique is, of course, sound. The fish have known about it for years. You could try, if your whales were cooperative, to send something, a piece of string, to go from underneath to the surface and to radio it out to the satellite. But if you can't do that, then acoustics is the only way. However, having been rather silly about that reply, yes, the techniques that we've heard about tonight of managing communication apply equally well to acoustics as they do to EM. So yes, you can apply the same signal processing, the same protocols, but using a different method of propagation.
Hello, David Miller, and thank you for the wonderful talks. As Mike is my dad, it was something precious and something that I grew up with, and a lot of the research and whatever, I remember talking about it around the table, and therefore I decided to become a chemical engineer. But one of the items that were discussed, and Sylvie brought it up, and Mark as well, was about how time changes the focus areas. And I think Sylvie talked about some of the research you were doing and how it kind of didn't have an application. You were too far ahead of your time. And then Mark talked about how satellites were kind of passé and people forgot about them for a while. And then they gained a resurgence. I think Sylvie talked about that artificial intelligence. So where do you see the next steps in technology development driving the kind of research that was happened going in communications, and what are the next steps in innovation that is going to drive that need again?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one actually sometimes that I wonder myself, because it seems to me that, I mean, you know, the magic answer would be AI. You know, there's lots of things to do in AI, but I think the closest I can come up with is quantum. I think that is the biggest thing at the moment that I think can potentially, it's a big game changer. Quantum communications, there are arguments about quantum computing. Do we believe in it or not? But certainly from my point of view, in terms of communications, that's probably the quantum area that is a game changer, still very unexplored at this stage.
I'll make a comment a little closer in than quantum, and that is how that's to do with supporting AI. We're now seeing special purpose chips being designed and built to speed up the processing, massive amount of processing for AI. And beginning in about 2000, the whole chip design, the chip companies, the chip research fell into a hole. And there hasn't been anything really interesting, innovatively in chips until about 5 years ago. Google figured that they did not have the computing power to do the training of the models. So they said, you know, with all that, they have more cloud computing resources than anybody on the planet, and yet they did not have the resources to train the models using the data from real life. So they set about designing special purpose chips. First one shipped in 2015. And since then, there's been an absolute flourishing of new companies to do AI chips. I mean, there are about 50 new startups doing AI chips. So that means then that, and it's both in the data centers, but as you need it, on the edge, and so it's also at the edge with the sensors, with the device that, so that's a fun area right now, but it is ahead of quantum.
Thanks. Thanks, Kylie. First of all, I'd just like to pay my own tribute to Mike. The 10 years I spent in Adelaide at UniSA, Mike was a huge influence and mentor to me as a colleague, and I certainly like to acknowledge that publicly. I'd also like to bring fraternal greetings from the Sydney division. Anne Green, recently recipient of an AC, our division chair, asked me specifically to convey those to the South Australian division from Sydney. But my question is really about how you see the work that you've described being developed at an order of magnitude greater pace, if you like, with the Australian Space Agency and the CRC, which is based here in Adelaide. Some sense of the future there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we'd all like to see our space industry ramp up as rapidly as possible. So I think there's great efforts being made to make people more aware about space and how we depend on it and use it. And I think there will be some time before all of the funding that's needed actually to so we can achieve our aspirations. It comes about. It takes time to ramp up there. We're heading in the right direction, but essentially, I think we do need to see a lot more investment in space technologies to go there. We have a choice though whether we're going to be dependent on technology from overseas or grab this ourselves. I think it's very important that there's now the Space Command within defence that's and I think that's really going to make a big difference in the future. Having the push towards sovereign control over some of these critical technologies is really important. Sylvie can probably say more about that.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time in Australia at the moment in the area of satellite communication, because you mentioned the Space Agency, but there's also a big defense project that's really about to build sovereign capability for Australia. So I think what we really need at the moment is to create this ecosystem, like with industry, academia, to be able to support all these efforts. And I think that's where the challenge is at the moment, to build the industry, to build also the workforce with universities and academia. But this is a very, very exciting time, I think, in Australia in the area of satellites or space.
I'll just add a quick word about we're in it. Some will say that we're in an area of new space. And let me say what that means. I'm involved with a CubeSat research centre at the University of Sydney. And new space means that you can get a high school student, a high school can get something into space. And so it's these very small satellites, the CubeSats, and we're on top of it here. One of the companies called Innovor at Lot 14 in Adelaide is a manufacturer and designer of CubeSats. But when Mike started to work in satellite communications and developing protocols and so on, the satellites were the size of a bus. And then they became the size of a big refrigerator. But now with the CubeSats, we're talking about 10 centimeters cube. And you gang them together, you put 3 together and so on. But this means that it's So you can share a ride with somebody else to go from Earth to the International Space Station. So ride sharing has now become common thinking. The high school students I've seen some of the brilliant experiments that are riding on these small satellites that are analyzing space weather, for example, that which causes, which analyzes the solar flares and their impact on the ionosphere or on our whole electricity grid. And so this has been enabled because we've now got the younger people involved, not major generals in the United States, but young people all around the world experimenting and coming up with that. I was at Lot 14 in Adelaide just last week at a breakfast meeting, and the sense of, it was to do with space, the sense of let's do it and let's do it quickly was so great. I hadn't seen it like this for a long time. And so it's got to do with we are in new space because it's so much cheaper.
I'd just like to begin by saying how wonderful it is to come together in Mike's name and in Mike's honour, speaking with regard to Mike's ability to influence almost everybody. I and Cohda were relentlessly pursued through many years to form relationships with Mike and the operations at the Uni of SA, and it was always done with such gentle but effective persuasion. I think that just is a measure of the man. I've also enjoyed the trip down memory lane. So for a chemical engineer, it's a really good summary of where we've been and where we've come from. And I think that's extremely helpful for us to keep an eye on where technology leads us. And in that vein, and with respect to CubeSats and small satellites, I'm fascinated by Myriota's opportunities and emergency response from space. It seems to me this enormous revolution to tiny, inexpensive, low-powered satellite communications capability must hold a big signal, you know, for the future of satellite communications, and seems very relevant to the questions that have been already asked. In that vein, how are we going? I would have thought there were multitudinous applications for environmental monitoring right around the world, for example, for emergency services provision when everything else is going wrong. How is that technology going? Where is Australia and South Australia placed? What's the future hold for that?
Yeah, thanks. Good, very good question. And just to pick up on Craig's point and the question again, we're certainly in a different place now with the availability of these very low cost launches and small satellites that can do a lot. So I think there's great opportunities with some of the combining of the functions that you're talking about, the ability to sense as well as to provide communications from a relatively low cost platform in space. It's up to people's imagination what they can do with that. So, for example, with the project I talked about, you know, we have potential to have satellites in space for, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, not tens of millions of dollars. So there's, you know, we could put something there that could really save lives and save huge amounts of money for emergency services by not just providing remote communications capability, but also being able to perhaps sense where there is a bushfire, also look at changing, you know, weather effects and things that just can't be done at the moment, but we now have access to that, and even students can do it. But yeah, it's some serious tools there that that are available. And we're developing a reputation, it seems, around the world. I mean, it's interesting that we've got NASA talking to us about, could Australia provide satellites for lunar orbits, you know, to look after their astronauts? That's great. You know, why us? But that's great.
We've heard a lot about, or a little bit about Mike as a wonderful technocrat and the technology he developed that's had an impact on South Australia and continues to have an impact on South Australia. We've heard a bit about how Mike's affected all of us, mentored or facilitated our careers professionally. But I wonder if I could take the liberty of asking David, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about Mike as a person. What was he like a dad, as a dad? Would you mind sharing that with us?
I guess it is a day for engineers to talk, and thank you. Mike is a dad. It's hard to explain. He's a really loving father. He was very interested in all of us. It was not David the son, it was Karen and Christina and everyone around, and our friends, and what we were doing and what entertainment and what we were doing. But it was also, it wasn't just, oh, here is what I do and how that's all important. He was interested in us, how we played in the Z Division hockey and everything else. He came along, gee, you've hit the ball twice for the whole day, but you were really good. But we had fun. And then he, you know, when all of us did our university, we went overseas, we went challenge, he was interested. So what were you doing? How are you doing it? How are you going? What were the people and the like? And so that's wonderful. And then later in life, we were sharing before, we did a nostalgia, a little bit like what we did here. And I was working in Canada and Mum and Dad came over and we visited where my father did his master's degree and I was in grade 3. And I said, we drove from there to there, and it was talking about his research and talking about what he did and what we did as a family. And it's so it's sort of great that you could have a balanced person who was really wanting to do well in what he was doing and really wanted to engage with people, and you know, had these guys like Mark who tried to pinch my wife and these other things. Not that we remember it, but except I used to get phone calls from the other. And it was wonderful that we could have these broader lives. I thought everybody. I didn't know, and we could share, and that he was interested, and I think kind of that diversity you talked about it, that it wasn't just because you're this type of person or from that ethnicity or from that environment. Basically cared about everyone, and that's why Dad was special to us, and hopefully special to all of you as well. So thanks.
I think that's quite a highlight to round out the questions. And look, you've all, I think pretty much everybody here has known Mike in some capacity, and some have known him a lot better than others, and we all have our own impressions and positive feelings and so on. And I hope that the evening has helped reinforce some of those and added to them of experiences that you're not aware of. I'm a civil engineer, so I don't understand very much about, we try to communicate, but it's usually by talking rather than using high-powered communications. But, you know, we heard a lot, I think, about Mike, both sides of Mike, really. Mike, the engineer, the entrepreneur, he worked with industry. He was so innovative. We also heard quite a lot about the human side, and that was the side that I was aware of through the academy, that, you know, he made you feel wanted. He liked to interact with people. He really liked forming groups and getting things done. And that was a really wonderful side. And it was great that David had a chance to talk about that as well. So I think we have to finish our questions on that and the formal part of the evening. Now we actually have another half an hour before we have to vacate the room, but we must be out of here by 6:30. So there's plenty of time for networking. But if you want to have another drink, please get one straight away, because the drink service is winding up. And thank you all for attending, and particularly thanks to Edith and the family for coming along. And I hope that this was a good evening for everyone who came. Thank you very much.